By the end of this video, you'll know how to use macro groups to make macros that are only available in certain websites like YouTube. You'll learn how to create macro palettes that enable you to do things like instantly resize the front window. You'll also learn how to add custom functionality to your menu bar. And finally, you'll know how to utilize smart groups to see macros based on custom filters. This is the full guide for everything you need to know about macro groups, palettes, and smart groups in Keyboard Maestro. So let's begin by talking about regular macro groups. We can make one by pressing this plus button or the shortcut of Command-Shift-N, which I'll do like this. And I'm just going to call this macro groups and palettes video, and you'll notice that I start it with a dash or a hyphen, and that's to make it appear alphabetically before all of my other macro groups, so it appears at the top here. So a macro group is just a folder that contains certain macros, so I could make as many macros as I wanted within a given macro group. And as I've talked about in previous tutorials, macros just are actions that are triggered by one of the triggers here. So we can come to the macro group settings and modify these to determine when and how the macros contained within this group or within this macro folder can be activated. Before we talk about all of these settings here, there's one exception or one special type of macro group that I'll mention, and that is the global macro group. The macros within this group can be activated from any application, and the group is always enabled. It can never be disabled. So you should include macros here that you would want to be able to activate under any circumstances. So for example, I have one that cancels all macros, which I want to be able to activate regardless of the conditions of my computer. So let's turn to the specific macro group conditions that we can modify. The first thing here is that you can change the icon to anything you want. There are a bunch of default icons here. You can also use the icon of an application from your computer, or you can build your own icon using this character developer. But for now, I'm just going to pick an icon from here. And now let's look at some of these conditions. So you'll notice there are 4 drop-down menus here. We'll take each of them in order. The first one is relating to the applications that the macros within the group will be active in. So by default, it is set to be available in all applications. So if I were to modify one of these macros, I'm going to add a new trigger just as an example. And then here I'm going to display text, and I'm just going to say test, and I'll have it display large. So if I activate this macro with the shortcut that I set before, then it will display the word test on the screen. So because this macro group is available in all applications, if I go to my browser, for instance, and I activate that macro, the word test will appear as well. And this will work in any application. However, we can change this to the next condition, which is available in these applications. So here we can select specific applications that the macro works in. So this is really useful if, for instance, I wanted to make macros that are only active in my web browser and no other applications. So coming to Brave, if I press that shortcut from before, the word test will appear. But if I press it in Keyboard Maestro, then it does not work because I've set this macro group to only be active in Brave. So a good example of this is a macro that I have here, which saves the front image from within a web browser. So what it does is it just right clicks on the front image, presses save as, and then saves it to the downloads. If I open up my downloads folder, you'll see it here. And so that's what it would look like manually, but using the macro, it looks like this, and it saves that image to my downloads folder. So that's something that I would only want to be active within Brave and maybe some other web browsers as well, like Firefox. So I just added Firefox here as well. and I would be able to use the save image as macro in any of these applications. But again, something like Keyboard Maestro, it wouldn't make sense necessarily to have that macro active. And you can see that when I try it within Keyboard Maestro, it doesn't do anything. It would only work in Brave or Firefox. The next condition is the exact opposite of the one we just looked at. It's available except in these applications. So again, using my display text example from before, if I activate it in Keyboard Maestro, it works. But if I try it in the browser, then it does not work anymore, since my browser is excluded from the list of apps that this macro group will work in. So this can be really useful if, for example, you have a game that you wouldn't want any of your macros to interfere with, but you'd want those macros to work in all other applications. Then you'd probably want to use the available except in these applications condition. The next condition here is available when these applications are running. So this is a bit different from the one before, available in these applications, because when an app is running, that means it may or may not be at the front. All it means is that the app is open, but it can be open in the background. So for example, Brave, my browser, is open in the background right now, which means that it is running, but it's currently not active. It's not the front application. So to give an example of this, I'm going to create a new macro, and I'm going to call it open new tab. And here I'll set a new trigger. And what this macro will do is it will call the new tab menu item from Brave. So I'm going to do Brave, file, new tab. And now when I go to Brave and I try this macro, it makes a new tab. But if I try it from within another application, it's also going to make a new tab. So you can see it quickly switched to Brave, and it created a few new tabs when I activated the macro. So again, this works because Brave is within the lists of applications that we've selected for this macro group to work in if those applications are running. Again, using the test macro from before, we can see that also works in Brave or in any other application because Brave is currently running. But now I'm going to come down to Brave and I'm going to quit it. And at this point, if I try any of those macros, they do not work because Brave is not running. So you can check if an app is active, if there's a dot underneath it here. But this doesn't include everything. If you want to see a more comprehensive list, then you'll have to open up the activity monitor, and in the tab, energy tab here, I think is usually the best place to see it. Any of these applications that are not grayed out, so like these ones are grayed out, all of these applications here are currently running. So if I added any of them to the list here, then this macro group would be activated. Okay, now let's look at the next condition, which is available when these applications are running, but not active. So again, running just means that it's open. It could be in the background or not, but active means that the application is at the front. So if it says running but not active, that means these macros will only be available if the application is running but not at the front. So for example, Brave now satisfies these conditions because it is running, it's open, but it is not the active application since it is not at the front. So to demonstrate that, I will display my test macro from before. And as we can see, the text pops up, but if I go to Brave and try it, it doesn't work. And if I quit Brave and try to activate the macro now, it likewise does not work. So this could be really useful if, for example, you have a music app like Spotify or iTunes that you want to control without switching to it. So if normally you go to that app and press the spacebar to pause or play your music, or use certain buttons within the app to go to the next track, you might not be able to use those same shortcuts like pressing the spacebar from within another app, but you could make a trigger here that would play your music or do something else like picking a random track and activate it only when the music application is open. So if I did something like this and had this group only available in music when music is open but not at the front, then I could activate my play music macro with a certain trigger. But then if the music app were open, then I could just use the default spacebar to pause or play the track. Next, let's look at the final condition in this drop-down menu here, which is available when these applications are not running. So if you select this option, then the group will only be active if the apps you have listed here are not open at all. And you might use this to do something like create a macro that restarts your computer, but it wouldn't activate if you had, say, a QuickTime recording that's currently recording your computer. So if QuickTime is open, then the restart macro would not work, and I'll just show what that would look like. So there is an action to restart the computer, but I'm just going to display text for now since I am recording, and I'll say display text large, restarting. So if this application is running, which it currently is, and I try that macro, then it wouldn't work. But if I were to close QuickTime, then this macro would activate and it would display the text restarting, or restart my computer if I had that action here. So basically, the applications that are listed here would prevent the macros from being activated if these applications are open. Okay, next let's take a look at the window conditions that we can set for our macro group. So just as an example of what we could do using these conditions, we could make a macro group that is only available when we're on the website YouTube. So here I have a group that's only available when I'm watching YouTube, and I have macros that will open watch later or open my history, but these macros don't work in any other tabs. So coming back to the example group that we have here, the default condition is to be available in all windows, so that would work regardless of the title or window condition, but we can change it to several other conditions here, the first of which is available when a focused window exists. So a focused window means that there is a window at the front, and you should be able to see these colored icons here at the top left. Something like this behind, which has grayed out icons, unless I hover over them, would not be the focused window. This is the focused window here, whereas the one behind is unfocused. Now it's also possible that no window is focused at all on the screen. This would be the case if, for example, none of your applications are open, or if you had a focused window open, which you then closed and nothing was focused behind it. So we might use this first condition here, available when a focused window exists, to do something like store a folder of macros that type out text. So I'm going to say type text, and here could be something like a typed string trigger, and I'm just going to say text. And here I will have it type, insert text by typing hello. So now since this macro can only be activated when a focused window exists, it would be impossible for me to activate it if a focused window does not exist. So if I come here to Obsidian and I type out that type string trigger and it transforms it into the word hello like I had before, that works because the front window is focused. But if I try to type that out again, I'm typing the word text and nothing occurs. The macro does not try to perform its actions because we set this to only be active when a focused window exists. The second condition is the exact opposite of the first, available when a focused window does not exist. I've never personally found a great use for this, but just thinking of some examples, you might use it if, for example, you set your macro group to be available in something like Slack, and then you had a macro that would bring a new window to the front or open the existing window if one didn't exist already. and that would only occur if the front window was not already focused. So the next condition here is available when a focused window title is, and then you input the name of some window here. So the way that you can see the names of different windows is by going to your mission control, either swiping up with 3 fingers on your trackpad or doing the shortcut Control Up arrow key. And that will bring up this window here where you can see the names or the titles of the windows like New Tab or Keyboard Maestro, Editor, and so on. Now the titles may not always be exactly what you see here. However, I did make a custom macro to get the front window title, and that looks like this. It displays the front window title here, and it copies it to our clipboard so that we can immediately paste it. So an example of where the title displayed here may differ from what the title actually is in something like the browser, where you can see here the name of this window, the title of the window is actually New Tab Brave Max Productivity, and that full title is not displayed here. So if I wanted to make a macro group where the macros are only active where the title is New Tab in my browser, then I could do that like this. And if I come to the tab and do my test macro from before, it works in that window, but not in any other. So if I go to any website like a typing test, then now that macro would not work from before because the title of this window has changed from the New Tab. So this can be really useful if you want macros that are available only on certain websites, kind of like the one I showed from YouTube, because the website is not its own application and you can't select it to be available from one of these application criteria. And in a little bit, we'll look at what to do when the title of the window may not exactly match one of the strings here. But say you wanted it to work on any browser that has the name New Tab in it. We'll get to that shortly. So the next criteria condition here is available when a focused window title is not. So that's the exact opposite of what we had before. So if I do my test macro, that will work in any application except for windows that have the title listed here. And then the next condition is similar to the one before, available when a focus window exists but the title is not. So the way that this differs from the one before, where the macro group is available when a focus window title is not, means that a window does not necessarily need to exist for this condition to be met. So for example, if I open up Finder and then I close it, so there's currently no focused window, then this macro would work as expected. So this means it can be triggered even when there is not a focused window at all. But in this next case, there must be some focused window in the first place. So if I open Finder and close it like this, so there's no focused window at the front, and I try my macro, then it doesn't work. However, if there is a focused window, then it will work as expected. So in other words, for this condition to be met, there needs to be a focused window in the first place. Now the remaining conditions here are similar to the ones we just covered, except they differ in that the next 3 use the word contains instead of is, and the last 3 use the word match instead of is or contains. So the difference between is, contains, and matches is pretty simple. Is means that whatever text we have here must match the title of the window exactly. So as I showed before, if the title of the window using that macro I had to get the exact title matches this exact string here, then the macro group would be activated. However, if we turn to some of the conditions that use contains, then the match does not have to be exact. So it can be a partial match of the window title. So if I just have the word new and I come back to this New Tab, then my macros work as expected. So Keyboard Maestro does not have the word new anywhere in the window title, whereas new tab does. So my macro group would be active in any window that contains the word new. So if I were to, for instance, change the title of this note to be new, and you can see new is contained in this title, then activating my macro or any of the macros from my macro group will work because the window title contains the word new somewhere in it. So again, there are two more conditions that use contains. One is does not contain, which is just the exact opposite of the contains condition. So if the word new is not in the title anywhere, then the macros in this group will work. So it would work in Keyboard Maestro, but it would not work in Obsidian or the new tab window because they both contain the word new. And then again, when a focus window exists but the title does not contain, refers to the fact that we require there to be a focused window at the front, in addition to there being a negation of this term in the title. So again, if there is no focused window at the front, then the macro would not work because there is required to be a focused window for it to be activated. Then finally, let's turn to the third of these keywords. We covered is and contains, and now let's take a look at matches. So matches means that whatever term we have here will be used as a regular expression. So regular expressions are beyond the scope of this tutorial, but I will make a whole video about them at some point, which I will link to in the description below once it's released. But just as a simple example, if you're unfamiliar with regular expressions, they're a way of specifying certain patterns or search strings. And you could do something like new tab or Keyboard Maestro. So this bar operator, this pipe operator here, acts as an or in regular expressions. So now if the title contains the word new tab or Keyboard Maestro, then all of the macros here would be activated. So as a demonstration, I can do my test macro. It works in any window that contains the words new tab or Keyboard Maestro within the title. However, regular expressions can get very complex, so I will save the discussion of them for the later video. And then again, for the matches, just as the is and contains, we can select the negation of that key term. So if the title does not match new tab or Keyboard Maestro, if it doesn't have any of those terms in it, then it will not work. So it does not work in Keyboard Maestro, it does not work in the new tab, but it does work in the window that does not contain either of those terms, new tab or Keyboard Maestro. And then finally, the last one, just as before, requires that there be a focused window in the first place that it will check this condition against. One final point about these conditions is that any of them can be mixed and matched. So we can add additional conditions here, like enabling these macros only within Brave browser, where the focus window title matches either new tab or Keyboard Maestro. So now this macro group will not be active within Keyboard Maestro or any window that contains Keyboard Maestro because the front browser or front application is not Brave browser. And within Brave, they will work if the titles are appropriate. So if I went back to the typing test, then again, it would not work here because the front window title does not match either of these terms. So coming back to my example from before, we can see that whenever the focused window title contains the word YouTube and one of these browsers is open, then the macros would be activated. Similarly, I have something for Anki where I have certain macros that are only available within the add window. So really there is no limit to how complex you can make these. You can have your macros active only within certain types of windows, within certain types of applications very easily using these settings. Before moving on to the remaining macro group settings, I think this is a good point to learn about palettes because they will come in handy for some of these settings here. So I just made another macro group where we can explore some features of palettes. Palettes are essentially just floating windows that contain actions that do things like activating macros or opening applications. And there are 4 types of palettes in Keyboard Maestro: the Applications palette, Conflict palette, Global Macro palette, and Macro Group palette, which we'll cover in order. So the first one is the Applications palette, which you can show from the Keyboard Maestro status menu or by using actions within Keyboard Maestro. So that would look like this: the Show Applications palette or Toggle Applications palette action. So if I add a trigger to this, then that will toggle the application palette whenever I press this shortcut. So here you can click on any of these application icons, so it kind of works like the dock down below, but it has additional functionality in that, first of all, it shows a check mark by whichever application is at the front. So if I go to Brave, then there's a check mark over the Brave icon or Finder or Keyboard Maestro. Beyond that, the application palette has additional features where if we right click on any of these apps or if we control click on them, we can see several different functions here that we could click on. So for instance, if I right click on Brave, I could activate it and hide all other applications. So I'll try that now. So at that point, Brave was activated and everything else on the desktop was hidden. I could also do something like reveal the file location of this app within Finder. I could also do something like get the info of this application, so that will pull up the information about it. Additionally, if I want to activate any of these options without right-clicking and selecting them, I can hold the appropriate modifier key like Shift or Option and do a normal left click on the application icons. So if I wanted to activate Keyboard Maestro and hide other applications, I could hold Option and left click on it, and now all other applications would be hidden. Finally, you can also drag and drop files onto specific applications to open the file within that application. The next type of palette is the conflict palette. So this will appear if you have multiple macros with the same trigger. It could be a hotkey trigger, it could be a type string trigger. But if you try to activate a macro that has a duplicate trigger, like Command Option Control 1, then this conflict palette will appear, which asks you to select which macro you intend to activate. You can either use the mouse button to click one of these, or you could use the first letter of the macro name that's highlighted, so T or M, to select which one you want to activate. So if I press T, then it's going to do the macro to toggle the applications palette. But if I wanted to activate a different one of these macros, which just display text in a window, I could type M and then the next unique letter, which would be 1 or 2. So if I did 2, that would activate macro 2 up here. Okay, the next type of palette is the global macro palette, which I explained in my triggers video, but I'll explain it again now. So here, if we have a macro with the global macro palette trigger, then that will cause the global macro palette to appear. It's just a floating window that appears on the screen whenever we have one or more macros with the global macro palette trigger, or if we configure our macro group to use the global macro palette for a certain functionality, which I'll address later in this video. So this global macro palette just contains any macros that have this trigger, and if we click it, like before, it will cause that macro to activate. We can also toggle the visibility of the global macro palette using actions like before. So I'm going to search for the global macro palette toggle action, and if I come here and add a trigger to it, and activate it, then it will cause the global macro palette to appear or disappear. As I'll show later in this video, we can also perform special functions with macro groups using the global macro palette. The final type of palette is the macro group palette, which we can use by activating this action, the show palette of macros. And what it does is it just shows all of the macros within a certain macro group. So if I come here and select any macro group, and I'll just actually use this macro group that we have here, and if I add a trigger to it, then activating it will cause a palette of all of the macros within this group to appear. So again, I can click on them, or I can type the first unique letter to activate one of them. There are also macro group settings and certain actions to show or hide palettes when certain conditions are met, like when you press a hotkey or activate a specific macro. So you could have a palette that appears only in certain applications, and that's something we'll explore shortly. First, however, I'll conclude this section on palettes by mentioning a few miscellaneous features. So one is that we can use a certain syntax to order the macros within a certain palette. So if I wanted macro 1 to appear after macro 2, whenever it appears in a palette, I can use syntax like this to order the macros within a palette. So this would put it as the first item whenever it appears in a palette, but I could do something like 5 and order macro 2 with 1, and I'll add an order to the rest of these as well using the same syntax. So I'll do 2. Okay, so I just added an order to the rest of these. And now if I activate our macro from before to show all of the macros within this group, you'll see that that numbering does not actually appear within the name. The number is hidden from the name. However, they appear according to the order that we set here. So macro 1 is the 5th one. It appears at the bottom. Macro 2 is the first one, and it appears at the top. So this can be helpful when you want to specify an order to your macros within a group, or maybe clump some of them together that you want to appear next to each other. Now we can also change the style of different macro palettes. So if we come and click on the style icon here, we can change things like the opacity of it. We can change the font size to be bigger or smaller. We can make it center text. We can add the trigger icon next to it so we can see the triggers as well, and many other settings. And this works for all different types of palettes. So if we come to the keyboard Maestro preferences, which you can get to by pressing Command, comma, and come to the palette style here, we can change the default palette style or the styles for the global macro group, application palette, or conflict palette. There are some default styles here that you could change your style to if you preferred one of these different styles. Another point to note is that you can have multiple palettes displayed on the screen simultaneously. So again, if I do something like toggle the global macro palette and I activate the applications palette, we can have both of these displayed at the same time. And I can even activate my macro group palette. So at this point we have multiple palettes open at once. And we can even have nested palettes. So within one of these, for instance, I could have a macro that leads to another macro palette. Okay, now we can turn to some of the remaining macro group settings. And for this, I actually made a fresh macro group with just a couple macros in it. So I have macros with one action each that just rescale the front window to different positions. So one is triggered by the down arrow key, which rescales the front window to the bottom half of the screen. And then I have one that does the same, but it rescales it to the left half, one for the right half, one for the top half, and one to reset the window back to full screen. So this one has a trigger with modifier keys, whereas the rest just have a single button one of the arrow keys. So this will provide a good example for us to explore each of these options here. By default, it is set to always activated, which means that assuming the other conditions are met, these macros can always be activated by pressing their relevant shortcut. We can change this to any of these options, however, the first of which is activated for one action when. And below there are three conditions. One is a hotkey condition, which if I enter some hotkey here, like Command Control Option 4, then now this macro group will only be activated when I press that hotkey. So if I press it, now I can press one of the arrow keys, but if I try to press the arrow keys again, they will not work because this macro group has only been activated for one action whenever I press this hotkey. So I'm going to try to press it again, and now the macro group is activated for one action, and I can rescale the front app to full screen. But if I try pressing it again, then the macro does not activate because this macro group has only been activated for one action after the hotkey has been pressed. I'm going to do it one more time and transition that. Now these other two options here have the exact same functionality as the hotkey. They will activate the macro group for one action. They're just other ways of activating it. So one is through the keyboard Maestro status menu. So if I toggle this check mark here, then now if I go up to the keyboard Maestro status menu, you can see that this option appears. And now if I press one of the arrow keys, the macro group works. And if I try activating it again, the macro group will work for one more action. The third option here is to display the macro group within the global macro palette. So I'm going to activate that shortcut I had from before, which had our global macro group activate. And now if I toggle this checkbox, then the macro group will appear within the global macro palette. So if I click it, then now I can use the arrow keys to toggle the full screen for one action. And I'm going to reset it back to full screen. Right below this, there's an option to display when I toggle the macro group. So you can see if I click it once, then it says activated. And if I click it again, the macro group is already activated for one action until I press one of the arrow keys, at which point I can activate it again. So I can mix and match any of these conditions here. I could have just the global macro palette be able to activate the macro group for one action and remove the status menu and hotkey, or I could leave all three of them, or any other combination of these ways to activate the macro group. And I'll return shortly to this option here to place the palette under the mouse because it does not apply to this condition here. So the next setting within this list is the activated/deactivated when. And all of the conditions here, by the way, have these exact same options: hotkey, status menu, and global macro palette entry. So this option here is just a way of toggling the availability of the macro group. So if I press the hotkey or one of the global macro palette entries here, we can see that the group is now activated. And at this point, I can use the arrow keys as many times as I want. The macro group is fully activated, not just for one action, but for as many actions as I want. And that will continue to be the case until I press the entry again, or I press the shortcut, which would disable the macro group. And now if I try to activate some of the shortcuts in my macro group, it will not work until I do something like activate the shortcut again, which will toggle the availability of the macro group. Okay, for the next three conditions, the macros within our group will only be active if there is a palette that is displayed for this macro group. So the first option is to show a palette for one action when one of these conditions is met. So I'm going to do the shortcut, and this will display our macro palette for this group. And now if I press any of those shortcuts, the palette disappears. And if I try to activate any of the macros again, they are disabled since the palette is no longer visible on the screen. If I do it again, I could do any of the macros and they will work for one action again. And I'm actually going to change the macro style to show the trigger on the right side. So now if I activate the group, you can see which trigger activates which macro. So if I do the right arrow, it will bring it to the right. And if I do the trigger I have here, it will turn it back to full screen. So this can be really useful if you want to use shortcuts or hotkeys like the arrow keys, which you normally want to be available to use as their default function as arrow keys, except for the one action when you display the macro palette. So in this case, you would only have to remember one keyboard shortcut to bring up the palette in the first place, and then you could just quickly use the arrow keys to rescale the front window. But they could be used normally at all other times. And this is actually a good place to explain this last option here, which is to place the palette under the mouse. So what this means is that when we activate one of these options here, calling the macro group palette, then that will be placed directly under the mouse. So if I do the shortcut, it places it directly under the mouse, or if I activate from the global macro palette, it places this macro group palette directly under the mouse as well, so I can easily click any of these options. And then the next of these three palette conditions is the show or hides a palette when. So this just toggles the availability of the palette, but the macros can be activated as many times as we want, not just for one action. And they will remain available until I do one of these options again to toggle the availability of that palette. And it's important to note that at this point, even though the macros have other shortcuts, since the macro palette is not displayed, they cannot be activated. So if I press the arrow keys, or if I press my hotkey to move the item to full screen, those macros do not work because the palette is not displayed on the screen. And then the final of these three palette conditions is one to show a palette until. So this causes the palette to appear, and I can activate any of the macros within the group as many times as I want until I press one of these options here. So if I do the shortcut, then it's gone. But if I press that shortcut again, it will also toggle it back. So you may think that this is just kind of the same as the one we showed before. However, it has additional functionality in that if we set this group to only be available within certain applications like the browser, that will also cause this palette to appear. So whenever the macro group conditions are met, like when you open an app that the group is available in, that will cause the palette to activate as well, in addition to the features that we have here. So if I go to Brave, then it causes the palette to instantly appear until I toggle the palette using the shortcut Command Control Option 4. And if I toggle it again, it'll bring it back. But once I leave the application by going back to Keyboard Maestro, that palette disappears because it is only available within Brave browser. So this is a really useful feature when you want to keep relevant macros always open within specific applications and that only appear once you open that application. Okay, the final three conditions here are exactly the same as the three that we just explored. The one difference is that the macros within this group can be activated even when the palette is not displayed. So before, in the three conditions above, the macros would only be active if the palette was displayed. But in this case, the macros will always be active. So they can always be triggered by another means, like a keyboard shortcut, and sometimes by the palette as well. So to demonstrate the first one, always activated and shows a palette for one action when. If I go back to Brave and I activate this group using the shortcut, then I can use any of the items within that group for one action. However, I can still use the default keyboard shortcut. So in this case, I'm pressing the arrow keys, and that is causing the front window to be rescaled as we would expect, even though that macro group palette is not displayed on the screen. So again, for the second one, it's always activated and shows or hides a palette when one of those options is clicked. So if I click it here, I can toggle the scale of the front window. And if I toggle that group, making the palette go away, those macros still work. So I'm using the arrow keys to rescale the front window. And then finally, we can do the one which is to always be activated and shows a palette until. So again, this causes the palette to appear whenever the other macro group conditions are met, but I can toggle it and still use the macros within that group. So if you're using these three conditions here at the very bottom, it probably doesn't make sense to have triggers like the arrow keys, because they will continue to trigger these macros even when the palette is not displayed on the screen. The final feature of macro group settings that I will show is to display the macro group in the menu bar. So I just made a new macro group here and removed the arrow key shortcuts from these macros so I don't accidentally activate them. But now we can come down here and change this option to display in menu bar. That will add a new icon up here to the menu bar, which we can click and see all of the macros within this macro group. And if we click on any of these, it will perform that macro as usual. Now there are 4 options here, which we can change. The first is to select the icon of the menu bar item. By default, you can have no item, which just displays the Keyboard Maestro logo, or you can select something like the macro group icon, which will display whatever icon you have here up in the menu bar. You can also select a custom icon, which you can paste an image into here. So if I were to say screenshot something like this and paste in the result, then you'll see that becomes the icon that appears in the menu bar. And we could also do something similar by including an icon from a clipboard, but that is beyond the scope of this tutorial. We can come down to the next item, which is to change the title of our menu bar item. By default, it will have no title, but we can change it to something like the macro group title. So you'll see up here, the menu item now contains the entire macro group name. We could also do a custom title, which can be any text we want. Say this is an example, and now that text appears up in the menu bar icon. And you'll notice here there's an option to update this text with a certain frequency. And the reason for that is that we can set this to include variables. So we could do something like include the system clipboard, which is just a variable, which will contain whatever we've most recently copied. And I could have it update every 5 seconds, for instance. So now if I come to an app and I copy something like this text, hello, you'll see up at the top that changes the text to whatever I've most recently copied. If I copied something else, then within 15 seconds, that text would change to whatever I've copied latest. It's also possible to just set this directly to a single variable, and that's actually how I'm used Keyboard Maestro to make this simple timer right here. So I'm just going to change this back to have no title for now. And the next setting is to include either all macros contained within the group, or to contain macros that have the group status menu trigger only. So I covered this in my triggers tutorial, but just to recap in case you haven't seen it, this will only include macros that have the group status menu trigger. So if we come back to the icon now, we can see that only the macros that have that trigger will appear in the menu bar icon. And we can create custom names here like macro 1, and that would change how it is named in the menu. Finally, we can have it include the macro icons when they appear here. So you'll notice the icons from on the left here where the macros are would be included in this menu bar icon. So that covers all of the macro group settings and conditions within Keyboard Maestro. And the last thing that I'll cover in this tutorial is smart groups. So we can create a new smart group by coming down here and pressing this icon below. And we can title this example smart group. So smart groups are folders that contain specific filters or search terms which can be used to help you find or organize certain macros more easily. So the way we create these filters is by typing text in any of these conditions here. So the first one by default which appeared was just a search term that only selects macros from the global macro group. So if I come down to the global macro group, this smart group will basically have a search term that has everything from the global macro group. If I add new filters or search terms, the macros that will appear in this smart group will be the OR of all of these terms. So in other words, it will contain all of the macros that are from the global macro group or all of the macros that fulfill any other condition. So I could say something like including the global macro group macros as well as all the macros that appear within the macro group example which we had before. So that smart group now contains everything from here as well as the global macro group. So smart groups don't affect the condition of the macros themselves, for instance, whether they can be activated or not. Unlike with regular macro groups, they're just a way to organize your macros in Keyboard Maestro or help you find macros more easily. And there are a number of different search terms that we can use to make very customized smart groups. So I'll include a link to this wiki page in the description below, but you can see that there are key terms for macro groups, macros that are available in specific applications, that are enabled or disabled, that have particular triggers, and so on. So an example that I made here is just one that has Anki and Obsidian macros. So what I did here was to filter for macros that have the name Anki in the title of them and are enabled, or macros that have the name Obsidian in the title. So this will get all of the macros that have Anki and are enabled, as well as all the macros that have the name Obsidian in the title, whether they're enabled or not. So this can be a useful way to really filter down your macros, and they can also be used to create macro palettes. So as we discussed before in the section about palettes, we can make shortcuts that will show particular palettes, and I could select a smart group as one of those palettes. So now if I activate this macro, it will open up all of the enabled macros that appear within my smart group. And you'll notice that some are missing, for example, this one or this one here. And that's because these macros still fulfill the original conditions of the macro group that they appear in. So for example, this macro I know is only available within Obsidian, and that appears here, which is only available when Obsidian is open. So for that reason, it would not appear when I create the macro palette that contains all of the macros within this smart group. So that's it for this video. We've covered all of the settings related to macro groups. We talked about macro palettes. And finally, we talked about smart groups. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe for more cool content, and I'll see you next time.